I was just curious, like how many other things in the Bible has like backstory like that? How many verses that I would read my whole life were not actually written by the person whose name on the book? I started thinking these type of question. So I started digging, and here's what I found. Biblical scholars across denomination, across belief system agrees on a whole list of textual issues, manuscript problems, historical contradiction, not fringe stuff, not like atheist talking points, actual academic consensus. These taught in Christian seminaries, evangelical colleges, and Catholic universities. This is very interesting part. A lot of Christian apologists just don't talk about these things. I think not because they are trying to hide something, not because they are being dishonest. It's more like these issues are genuinely complicated, and honest answer takes time, longer than a bumper sticker can hold, I would say. Today I'm walking you through 6 of the biggest one, and here's what I'm not saying. These do not invalidate the Bible. They don't prove Christianity is false. They don't mean your faith is built on sand. What they do show you actually is how ancient texts actually lived, how they were copied, expanded, interpreted, and understood by real people in real communities. And that's honestly kind of beautiful if you know what you're looking at. If you know that we are following the truth, you follow the truth, right? You go for it. You start digging to find out what's going on. So whether you are a believer looking for a real answer, a skeptic wanting to know if these criticisms hold up, or just someone curious about how we got the Bible, stick around. Let's dig in. What scholar mean by error? This is my first slide. Here we go. By the word, sorry, that's my seminary. Okay, what the scholar means by error. Before I jump into example, I need to clarify something, because that's very important, because I see that some people just misuse the word error, because the word error gets misused in so many places. So when a textual scholar says there is an error in the Bible, they don't mean God got wrong or made a mistake. They don't mean that original author made a mistake, or God did wrong, or something like that. What they mean is copied version we have are different from what were originally written, sometimes insignificantly, I would say. Think of it like this. Like this is the example that my professor gave me. Imagine I write you a letter by hand. That's the original. Now imagine you have to make 10 copies of the same letter by hand. No printing press, no photocopy, just pen, paper for hours. Probably not paper, probably papyrus. You're probably going to misspell a word here and there, skip line accidentally, add the clarifying notes in the margin, probably maybe even reword or something you think it's unclear. You're trying to correct a text or a previous scribe or somebody who copied. After 10 copies, are there errors? Well, sort of, I guess, but they are not your errors. They are copyist errors. Somebody who copied and then you copy from that copy. That's what we are talking about today. We have thousands of ancient manuscripts of the New Testament. None of them match perfectly. And scholars have spent centuries mapping out these variants and where and why they differ. Probably the most well-known textual critic, at least in the United States today, is Bart Ehrman. He's a textual critic from UNC, probably the most famous scholars in this field. Had a great line. He says, we have more copies of the New Testament than any other ancient document, but we also have more differences between those copies than any other document, which is kind of funny, right? Our abundance becomes a problem. So the point is, this isn't controversial among scholars. This is just how text transmission worked in the ancient world. It's not just about Bible or New Testament. It's about every single text that we have from ancient world. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at some specific example that you probably heard, but I'm going to, explain something that probably you never heard it from the angle that I'm trying to show you. Let's start with the Gospel of Mark, ending of Mark. It's the shortest gospel, probably written around 65 to 75. We don't know exactly, but probably around 70. And it has one of the weirdest ending in the Bible, right? So the two oldest complete copies we have of Mark is Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, both from 4th century. They both end at Mark 16:8. These two manuscripts that we have are oldest manuscript that contained chapter 16 of Mark. And you know what verse 16:8 says? Okay. And they came out of the tomb, the woman, they came out of the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the ending of Mark. That's it. That's the ending. The woman find the tomb empty. A young man tells them Jesus has risen. They are terrified. They run away, and then everything fades to black. No Jesus appearing to the disciple. No go and tell the Peter, like other gospel, no peace be with you. Nothing. Just fear and silence. So now your Bible probably doesn't end here. Your Bible probably has verse 9 to 20. At least mine has. I'm not sure about your Bible, where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, then to other disciples, and give them the Great Commission, right? So what happened? Here's what scholars found. Those 12 verses, the longer ending that we call them longer ending of Mark, don't appear in the earliest manuscripts. They show us starting in 5th and 6th century. They were not added by earliest copyists, but by later copyists. Was it intentional? Probably. Someone probably thought this ending feels too abrupt. Let me add the resurrection appearances, Jesus' message about going to all nations. It's beautiful addition, I guess. It is so beautiful, but it's not Mark's original ending. That's the point. Now, apologists usually handed this one of two ways. Either they will say, well, probably some manuscripts have it, which true, but misses the point. The oldest one don't, or they don't mention that at all. So, but there is what's interesting here is scholars across denomination, evangelical, Catholic, mainline, Protestant, secular, they all agree. Bruce Metzger, who was deeply faithful Christian scholars, said the longer ending is a later addition. Even the most conservative scholar we have admit that. I mean, every scholar that we have admit this point. Why? Because the manuscript evidence is too clear. It's one of the clearest cases of textual addition we have. And what does it tell us? It tells us that early Christian communities cared about completion. They care about closure. They care about completion and closure. And when they felt Mark's ending was incomplete, they added one. It's not corruption, it's interpretation in action. So let's back to another textual variant that we have. So I talk about this. Let's go to another story. Here's one surprise. This is surprise people because that's a very famous story. You know the story, a woman caught in adultery, right? The scribes and Pharisees bring her to Jesus and say, the law says we should stone her. What do you say? And Jesus responds with the perfect line, let he who has no sin, without sin, cast out the first stone. It is one of the most beautiful moments in the gospel. Mercy, wisdom, and grace. So it's a beautiful story. I love the story. But here's the thing. Again, here's the thing in this story. This story doesn't appear in any manuscript before the 5th century. The oldest copies of John, it's not there. Most of the scholars think it was floating around as an oral tradition or maybe a separate written story, we don't know. And somewhere around 400 centuries, someone inserted into John's gospel at this location, that like chapter 7. Now, does that mean that it didn't happen? Not necessarily, I guess. It might be real event. It might be accurate memory. We don't know. But definitely wasn't a part of the Gospel of John. The like original Gospel of John, or whoever wrote John. Some apologists say, well, it is in a lot of later manuscripts, so it should be included. True, it is in a lot of later copies, but in lots of later copies isn't the same as original, I guess. We have to admit that. What's interesting is, I guess, even conservative scholars admit this. The story is too late and so disconnected from earliest witness that most evangelical churches now acknowledge that it is a later edition. But it is a really important example of something a scholar called Scribal altruism. Scribal altruism. Copyists didn't change text, they added what they thought was good material. They were trying to improve or expand the clarity of trying to do something to the text to make it more better, nicer, makes. And we can actually see this happening in real time by comparing manuscript. If you have two manuscripts, you see why the scribe changed the word. They start thinking, developing the argument of why we have differences and why this scribe changed these texts. Okay, here's one that's maybe less famous but more interesting because it's about contradiction. So Matthew and Luke genealogy. Matthew and Luke both give genealogies of Jesus from Abraham down to Joseph, right? If you read these two texts, Matthew 1 and Luke 3, you will see Luke 4, you will see the genealogy and you will see the differences. And the problem is they don't match. Matthew has Jesus descending from David through Solomon, but Luke has Jesus descending from David through Nathan. And the genealogies between David and Jesus have almost completely different names. Now, these can't both be historically accurate. Both of them cannot be accurate account of the same family tree. They're just too different. You can't come up with something that showing that, okay, you can solve the problem. These are the different names. But the question is, what's going on? Scholars across the board, and I mean evangelical scholar, Catholic scholar, secular scholar, agree on this. Neither genealogy is meant to be precise historical record. They are theologized, trying to, bring everything to theology, based on theological point of view. They're theologized genealogies. Matthew is making theological point. Jesus is the rightful heir to Davidic throne, so he structured the genealogy to emphasize the royal line through Solomon. 13 generation before the exile, 13 during, and 13 after. Numerical symbolism. It's theological architecture. Luke is making different point. Jesus in Luke, it's universal savior, connect to all humanity. So Luke traces the genealogy all the way back to not Abraham, but Adam. Here's what amazing. Ancient people did this all the time. It wasn't deceptive. It was theological rhetoric, I would say. And Matthew and Luke were both sophisticated enough to rewrite genealogy to make their theological claims. That's what I understand from why we have two different genealogy, which cannot be reconciled, cannot be harmonized, I guess. That's not an error to me. That's a genius. That's like ancient rhetoric. But apologists often try to harmonize these genealogies, come up with explanation for why they are different. And honestly, to me, that's very awkward. It's much more honest to just say these aren't competing historical accounts. They are theological statements. Matthew and Luke are making different claims about who Jesus is. I think honestly, sometimes it's better than to just, trying to play with words. Now, we get into something that historian has been wrestling with for centuries. And I asked this question from every scholar that I met. Luke says that Jesus was born during the Census of Quirinius, the governor of Syria. This was a tax census around 6 CE according to some sources that we have. Except there's a problem here. If you know Josephus, a great Jewish historian, in Josephus' story that he told us about Quirinius, and dating of his ruling is different. We know from multiple historical sources, including Jewish historian Josephus, that Herod the Great died in 4 BC, and Matthew says Jesus was born while Herod was still alive. So Jesus was born no later than 4 BCE or BC. But the Quirinius census that Luke refers to happened in 6 CE, 10 years later. How can we understand this? So there's a lot of theories out there. Either Jesus was born in 4 BC before Quirinius census, Jesus was born in CE after Herod died. Both can't be true. If you compare these texts, both of them cannot be true. That's a point, because Matthew explicitly mentioned about that, and Luke says something different, and when you compare it to Josephus, everything will be kind of confusing. Now scholars have proposed solution. Some say Luke meant a different census. Some say he was confused about the dates. Some say that even I heard myself. Some say there was an earlier census by Quirinius we don't know about. This is what Josephus actually tell us about these census. Josephus was a Jewish historian writing in around 90. Here's our primary source on 1st century Jewish history, and Josephus lists the governors of Syria, the census, the key events of what's happened in that era. We have records of these in Josephus, and there is no record of Quirinius being governor of Syria until 6, and no records of any census connected to him earlier than 6 CE. So either Luke got timeline confused or conflated 2 different events, or he was working from sources we don't have access to. I know that Mark Goodacre actually have a very good answer for this question that I heard in his course Mysteries of Synoptic Gospel, but there is a lot of different views on these. What do scholars think? Most think Luke was trying to anchor Jesus' birth in a historically significant moment, the Quirinius census, but got the timeline wrong. He knew it was important for dating, so he included, but the dating just doesn't fit. This is historical error, not the textual one. Luke wrote it this way. He wasn't miscopied. He was mistaken about the chronology. We have to admit that. And honestly, that's not that weird. Ancient writers, even well-intentioned ones, sometimes got dates wrong. We have to check them against one another and sources like Josephus to find out what is more probable. This is why historians care about these things, not to attack faith, but to, understand what actually happened. And now I'm going to talk about the resurrection account and the kind of contradiction in these gospels that we have when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection account, who saw risen Jesus first, comparing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Maybe the most significant one, because it was like central to Christian faith. We all read these texts, but probably we don't read them like in a way that today we are going to read them. Our 4 gospels describe the resurrection, but they describe it very differently. When you compare just these texts together and put them line by line, in Mark, in Gospel of Mark, the earliest one that we have, women go to the tomb, they find it empty. A young man, just one young man, tells them Jesus has risen. They run away and they're afraid. And that's it. That's the original ending of Mark. Women ran away because they've been informed that Jesus was risen by a man. In Gospel of Matthew, women go to the tomb. Jesus appeared to them. He tells them to tell the disciple to go to Galilee. There they will see him. We come to Luke. In Luke, women go to the tomb. 2 men in dazzling cloth tells them Jesus has risen. The disciples stay in Jerusalem. Jesus appeared to them there in Jerusalem. And in John, we just hear the Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb alone, right? She sees Jesus but doesn't recognize him. Later, Jesus appeared to the disciple in locked room in Jerusalem. This is John. Now, look at that. These aren't just different perspective on same event. These are contradictory claims. Here we go. Key contradiction in Matthew, Luke, and John. Details. Who saw Jesus first? Matthew says woman. Luke says none initially. And John says Mary Magdalene alone. Where did Jesus appear to them? Matthew says Galilee. Luke says Jerusalem. And John says Jerusalem in the locked room. So did people recognize him immediately according to these texts that we have? Matthew says yes, Luke says no, and John says no too. So you see what I mean. These are not textual problem, or these are different claims. So there's a question here. What do apologists do with these type of differences, discrepancies, whatever you want to call them? So I think it's very important, right? Usually they try to harmonize them. They say, well, maybe Jesus appeared to these people in these sequences, and they create these elaborate timeline trying to make all 4 accounts fit together into one coherent story. Maybe they will come up with something like that. But scholars ask a different question. Why are these accounts so different? And I think that's a very genuine question if somebody asks. Why these accounts are so different? And here's the answer. Because these are memories transmitted through different communities. At least I learned this from my class in a social memory theory class. Here we go. Why so differences? Oral tradition and development. Mark was written maybe 40 years after the crucifixion. Matthew and Luke probably 50 to 60. And John probably 60 to 70, right? Years later. Like 60 years after the crucifixion, somebody by the name of John writing something that we have today. In this time, these stories were told and retold in different Christian communities. In Jerusalem communities, the resurrection appearances happen in Jerusalem. In Galilee community, they happen in Galilee. Different communities emphasize different witnesses. That's why we have it like in Matthew, appearances happen in Galilee, but in Luke happened in Jerusalem. Paul actually gave us earliest account written around 20 to 25 after the event, after the crucifixion. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists the resurrection appearances to Peter, to the 12, to 500 believers, to James, all the apostle, and to Paul himself. But, there's a but here. But Paul doesn't mention the woman at all, that we have it in 4 Gospels. And he doesn't give a narrative, he just lists appearances. And that was my question when I interviewed Dale Allison, why he never ever mentioned woman. But although we have it in 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, somewhere between Paul's list 50 CE and Gospel 70 to 90 CE, the stories developed, expand, and become more narrative, get localized to different regions. The woman becomes central, the narratives get more detailed, different type of resurrection bodies developed. Sometimes Jesus is physical enough to eat fish, like in John 21. Sometimes he appeared in locked room without using the door. He just come in and go out. So these are amazing things. Now, does this mean that resurrection didn't happen? Scholars disagree on that, but they all agree on one thing on this. The gospel accounts reflect remembered and interpret tradition, not eyewitness video recording. This is important. So, I mean, about the historicity of resurrection, there's a ton of book out there. Michael Icona, Dale Allison, Tom Wright, and so many other. And honestly, that makes sense. You can't have 4 eyewitnesses give identical account of any event. Memory doesn't work that way. What we are seeing is how early Christian remembered and understood the most central event of their faith. That's not corruption, that's transmission. So I'm trying to show you that if you read the text carefully and become a careful reader of the text, you will see these things. Now, Scribal, Altruism, Copyist, improving the text. So this is another one. before we finished, I have to admit that after I read a lot on textual criticism and now reading the Bible and seeing these differences, I completely agree that scribe changed the text. One more before wrap up here. Throughout the New Testament, there are places where a scribe expanded Jesus' words or apostle words to make them more clear or more, emphatic kind of. This is the kind of duty of a scribe, it seems, at least in earliest stages. And if we know more about textual criticism, for us it's very normal to see these, alteration and adding and removing and omitting and things like that. Example, in some manuscript, when Jesus forgives sins, the text adds, and if you do not forgive, neither will your Father forgive you. In other earliest manuscripts, that clause isn't there. Why? Scribe probably thought, okay, this needs emphasis. The forgiveness principle should be stated both positively and negatively, so he added, not in a way to just deceive us, but it seems to describe that it just more makes sense if he add such a line to the text. Another example, like in Johannine comma, that probably most of you know, like in 1 John 1, 7, 5-8. Later manuscript add this phrase about 3 witnesses in heavens, which become important for Trinitarian theology. But the earliest manuscript don't have it. Scholars call this Scribal Altruism. Copyist improving the text as they understand it. Now, none of these changes destroy the meaning, but they show us that the text wasn't static. It was living communities were shaping it. The community of faith shaping it were shaping it in a way that even they interpreting it different way to clarify the thing that they trying to communicate with their people, with their communities. I think people have different views on that, why this matters. But for me, this matters because, we have to be aware of the fact that when we read the gospel or the Bible, we are reading a human book that come from a human hand and coming from, transmission centuries after centuries. But I want to reframe this and saying this line at the end in this way. So, human document in human history. As I write it here, the Bible is a human document embedded in human history. That's not weakness, it's honestly. These aren't like hidden secret. They aren't things scholars are trying to keep from you. These are things taught in seminaries, in evangelical seminaries, in Christian seminaries, and in Catholic institutions. The reason apologists sometimes avoid these issues isn't because they are ashamed. It's because their honest answer is complex, and complexity is harder to communicate in a 30-second argument. But I think if we want to be a careful reader of the New Testament, we have to be aware of the fact that we have these type of things in the history of the text that we receive. Think about it this way. What these textual and historical issues tell us is that the Bible is a human document. It was written by human, it was copied by human, it's transmitted through the human communities. So, but sometimes we gave a lot of inspiration things into the Bible. That's why for us it's very hard to even accept such a thing. And human documents are messy. They contain mistakes, they contain interpretation, they contain disagreement. But that's not a weakness of the Bible. That's actually a strength from my perspective, because it means that the Bible isn't asking you to believe something disconnected from reality. It's rooted in history, in human experience, in actual community that wrestling with these texts and with this question about Jesus and what his life meant to us. So I hope you enjoy these talks. If you find any valuable things in these series and in these talks, consider subscribing, liking the video, or asking a question or making a comment down below. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.